I call to order this hearing of the Subcommittee on Competition Policy, Antitrust, and Consumer Rights on reining in dominant digital platforms, restoring competition to our digital markets. I'd like to welcome our witnesses and thank Senator Lee and his staff for helping to plan this hearing. We all know that a few dominant online platforms have the power to control whether and how businesses can access customers and markets online. These dominant platforms often abuse this power to preference their own products in a way that stifles competition and innovation. Last Congress, between the House and the Senate, over 150 hearings on the tech issues were held. Let me say that again. I don't mean to not make you guys feel special, but 150 hearings were held, and we did make progress. In addition to the House report that Representative Cicilline and Representative Ken Buck, as well as the chairs over in the House put out, we passed some bills. The Senate Judiciary Committee, as you know, passed out the bill on changing the merger fees that Senator Grassley and I had, as well as the bill that Senator Lee and I had that Senator Lee led on venues. Both bills passed at the end of last year as a part of the year-end budget, and Senator Lee and I worked together, and I believe those are very important pieces of legislation for assisting those at the state and federal level that are going after these cases. The Senate Judiciary Committee also reported the bipartisan American Innovation and Choice Online Act to the Senate floor, making it the first tech competition bill voted out of this committee since the dawn of the internet. This isn't just about the money for enforcement or about state efforts. This is actually about federal efforts and the need to change the laws to fit the times. A few weeks later, the Open App Markets Act, something led by Senator Blumenthal and Blackburn and myself, was also reported out on a strong bipartisan vote. But after an unprecedented lobbying effort by the dominant platforms, as in I remember in August of last year, they'd spent more money on legislation, according to a Bloomberg report, than any other entities, industries, even more than pharma had at that point. I don't have updated numbers, but I know that nearly, probably over $200 million was spent against this bill in states all over the country with ads that had nothing to do with each other for red states and blue states to show their dominance. These bills did not get a vote on the floor, and let me give you some numbers. I just noted the millions of dollars in advertising against the bills, $90 million on lobbying over the previous 18 months. In just 1 week last May, one industry group spent $22 million on TV ads against the American Innovation and Choice Online ad. I want to note for the companies enjoyed the pop-up ads run in D.C. against me that said, Amy Klobuchar, and I love the way your lawyers insisted on putting in small letters, Amy Klobuchar could destroy Amazon Prime. Amy Klobuchar could, in really small letters, destroy Google Maps. They were well noted. Congratulations on your money spent. These companies have only become more brazen since then, with armies of lobbyists and lawyers. They are in every corner in this town, at every cocktail party, and all over this building. But it's easy to see why they don't want us to act. We would be happy to work with the companies on legislation, but they shut every single thing down. Why? Because they can. Google has 90% market share in search engines. Apple controls 100% of app distribution for iPhones. 3 out of every 4 social media users use Facebook or Instagram. Amazon accounted for about 40% of the entire U.S. e-commerce retail market last year. That's dominance under any way of looking at the antitrust laws, something that I know the Justice Department is looking into as we speak. So while many have said all the right things about fostering innovation, helping small businesses, and improving privacy, when it comes to actual action, we have done nothing in this Congress, with the exception of the funding, which I will say is incredibly important, and the venue bill. We have done nothing in terms of setting standards when it comes to tech. Nothing out of the Congress on privacy, nothing out of the Congress on updating the children's protection bills when it comes to the internet, nothing on the Congress when it comes to dominance on the platforms and self-preferencing, nothing out of the Congress on AI. You can come to your own conclusions on why that has happened, but I think you all know when you talk to parents who are trying to help their kids to do their homework and not spend their whole day on social media or be exposed to bad stuff, or when you talk to small businesses like those in the national NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, which is not exactly known as a liberal group that has endorsed the bill that we are in part talking about today, I think you then understand what's going on in this country and why we need some rules of the road and why there has been bipartisan support for these bills. I'm well aware of what's going on in the House, and the Congressman Buck, who I spoke to this morning, his loss of his committee post, which he did so well. And I'm well aware of some of the changes made to that subcommittee that have made it harder and harder for us to proceed with these bills. We have to be honest about that. But to just close our eyes and do nothing and let another 2 years go by is a huge mistake. And that's why we're having this hearing, and that's why we're moving ahead. While we fail to act, the dominant platforms use their control to suppress the competition and rake in billions at the expense of consumers. If you don't want Meta to have your data and sell it to advertisers, tough luck, because you will have to avoid using Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger. If you don't want to use the Apple App Store, tough luck, because there is no other way to get your apps on the iPhone. And if you're a small business that wants to use a local delivery service instead of Amazon's shipping system, tough luck, because because it is virtually impossible to get to the top of Amazon's search listings unless you buy Amazon's shipping systems. Small businesses are beholden to digital gatekeepers that can block access to their customers, take their data, and demote them in search rankings while copying their best ideas and bringing them to market on their own. That discourages businesses from innovating and deters investors from putting money into startups. They all know the game is rigged. We know that other countries are taking action. They are leading the way in the digital age. I wish we were. I know Senator Hawley has some ideas on how he would like to proceed. I know Senator Lee has tons of ideas. But in fact, let's be honest, that's not happening right now. The European Union enacted the Digital Markets Act, which puts regulatory restrictions on how the largest digital platforms can use their power. Australia is considering similar reforms to protect digital competition. I'm glad they're doing this. It will give us good examples. It will show that the market is still vibrant even when they protect their consumers and they have the guts to pass something. The UK is considering legislation to further empower its digital markets union, and South Korea enacted new rules to open up app markets. If Congress does nothing, we abdicate America's leadership position on global competition policy. We let foreign laws become the global standard for regulating American digital businesses around the world. And while the dominant digital platforms lobby against legislation in the United States, they are agreeing to the same common sense rules in other countries. That may be the biggest hypocrisy of all. It's okay to give small businesses some rights in Europe. It's okay to have help for consumers and protection for consumers in the UK or Australia. But here, where they are allegedly hometown companies where they're supposed to be looking out for Americans, they fight it tooth and nail. The good news is that there's still a bipartisan majority in both chambers that is ready to take action. Bipartisan legislation with Senator Grassley and other members of this committee, the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, as well as Representative Cicilline and Buck in the House, which establishes rules of the road for dominant digital platforms and prevents them from favoring their own products or services just because they own them. These are targeted reforms to address anti-competitive behavior, level the playing field for businesses, and increase choice while driving down costs for consumers. And these reforms do it without compromising privacy or security. That's why, as the Attorney General said last week, the The Department of Justice, along with the Commerce Department, endorses the bill. The bill also, as I already noted, has strong support from the National Federation of Independent Businesses, Consumer Reports, the Main Street Alliance, and Consumer Federation of America, and many civil society groups across the political spectrum. I also joined Senator Blumenthal and Blackburn to introduce the Open App Markets Act to give app developers more power to reach their customers without the control of app stores run by Apple and Google. And I am working with Senator Lee on this bill to improve competition and transparency in ad technology markets. We're going to be having another hearing to focus on that soon. Here's the bottom line. We cannot afford to waste another 2 years getting nothing done, another 2 years for these monopolies to further entrench their power, another 2 years of unchecked anti-competitive self-preferencing, another 2 years of small businesses closing up shop, another 2 years of failing to protect American consumers while the rest of the world moves forward. And I am well aware that the content arguments are used, and they're very different, the arguments that are made to the left from the right. One day I hope to publish the sentences that said that the companies give to the right and what they give to the left. And at some point we know that they're the same because they're designed for one thing, and that is to stop these bills and maintain their dominant position. I know eventually we're going to get this done, even if it means all these other countries went before us and there'll be pressure for them to agree to it in America. Eventually we will. But for the good of the people of this country, I hope it is sooner rather than later. I look forward to continuing to work with colleagues on both sides of the aisle. And with that, I turn it over to Senator Lee.
Thanks so much, Madam Chair. If it seems like we've had this hearing several times before, well, it's because we have. But it's also because finding a way to rein in the pernicious influence of big tech remains one of the most pressing public policy concerns of our time. These aren't the first monopolies, by any means, that America has endured and has had to figure out how to deal with. We've dealt with them before, but never before have we seen just a handful of trillion-dollar corporate bureaucracies exercising such pervasive control over how we stay in touch with friends and loved ones, how we shop to provide for our families, obtain news and other information, exercise our First Amendment rights, influence public debate, and even how we turn on our air conditioning and lock or unlock our doors. All of that is on top of the fact that they're doing stuff to our kids that many of us find very disconcerting. Big tech's business plans are built on an addiction business model, and our children are uniquely vulnerable to fuel their growth and their expansion as attractive targets for those businesses. What's sold as fun and as a matter of convenience seems to more often end up as a gateway to pornography and to Chinese propaganda. But for them, a click is a click. Yet, while big tech profits have grown significantly, so have teenage anxiety, depression, and suicide rates. These companies don't just track where we go, what we say, what we buy, who we talk to, what we read. They actively influence and direct nearly every facet of our lives to ensure that our patterns of behavior remain what's most profitable for them. Not content to stifle competition in their respective commercial markets, big tech increasingly works to kill competition in the marketplace of ideas. Woke ideology is seeped from universities to the boardroom, and it's now being foisted upon consumers in the form of censorship and exclusion from the 21st century public square. Even worse, we now know that these companies have been colluding with the federal government to do so, a gross violation of our constitutional rights. It turns out big tech and big government share a lot in common, including their love for surveillance and censorship. They don't necessarily bring out the best in each other, and that's putting it mildly. So it's not surprising that so often when we see big tech tracking and censoring us, it turns out that big government was there egging them along, facilitating it, perhaps requesting it all along. In the past, there was at least some consolation in the idea that market forces would eventually intervene. that changes in technology and new innovation would somehow disrupt incumbents and provide consumers with new choices. Today's monopolists, however, control much of the consumer technology and innovation themselves. And what they don't control, they actively endeavor to buy up before it can become a competitive threat that might actually risk displacing them or disrupting their control of the marketplace. This is precisely why there's such strong bipartisan support for the idea that we need to find ways to ensure that the same companies that began as innovative startups disrupting stagnant markets to improve the lives of consumers don't end up as entrenched as the monopolists undermining competition at the expense of consumers and American society itself. This is an incredibly important task, and one that I take very seriously as someone who has long championed Congress's unique legislative prerogative and responsibility to make law. Neither the judiciary nor the executive branch can solve these problems alone. Congress must act. At the same time, we also have a duty to ensure that the cure isn't something that turns out to be worse than the disease. As concerned as I am by the behavior of big tech, I'm equally concerned that some of the bills that have been introduced to solve one problem or another simply replace a corporate tyrant with a government tyrant. They would replace a lack of competition with an excess of government micromanagement by bureaucrats, trading one form of dysfunction for another. Ironically, it's often this very kind of regulation that leads to consolidation in the first place, pushing firms to merge, thereby erecting barriers to entry and protecting themselves from competition. Congress should prefer targeted, detailed legislative solutions to broad, vaguely defined grants of new authority to federal agencies. As I've said before, it's important that Congress solve the problems presented by big tech rather than broadly delegating the issue off to federal bureaucrats and agencies subject to regulatory capture and unaccountable to voters. I remain particularly opposed to the idea of granting any new authority to the Federal Trade Commission. Unfortunately, the radical agenda of the Biden FTC has made it even harder to find common ground in the fight against big tech. Even passing a bill to update the merger filing fee structure, something that should have been uncontroversial, was needlessly difficult and almost failed simply because of the overreach and the incompetence of the FTC under the current administration. I'm grateful to Senator Klobuchar for convening this hearing because we're here to discuss some really important issues and for continuing to be a valuable legislative partner as we both work toward bipartisan solutions to shared challenges. I look forward to our discussion today and to hearing later this month that we'll be having to discuss our America Act to tackle competition in digital advertising. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Lee. I now want to introduce our witnesses. Fiona Scott Morton is a professor of economics at the Yale School of Management, where she teaches competitive strategy and antitrust economics. Chris Lewis is president and CEO of Public Knowledge, a nonprofit public interest group in digital competition. Daniel Francis is an assistant professor of law at New York University. Adam Kandub is the director of the IP Information and Communications Law program at Michigan State University. And Amanda Lewis is a partner at Caneo Gilbert and LaDuca LLP, where she specializes in antitrust and consumer protection. If the witnesses could now please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before the subcommittee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. I will now recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes of testimony, each starting with you, Professor Scott Morton. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Klobuchar and Ranking Member Lee, for the invitation to testify today. I have only a few points to make. The modern interpretation and application of U.S. antitrust laws has failed to preserve competition in today's digital platform markets. Relying on entrenched monopolists to innovate and create competition is foolhardy and unsupported by economic learning. The perfect antitrust law would be a great help, and I would firmly support that, but my understanding is that such a law is not on the menu today and will not be anytime soon. This means our choice is between the status quo and the bills we're here to discuss today. Larger budgets for antitrust enforcement are also necessary, and I support those. But litigation is an expensive, uncertain, and slow method to stop the behaviors Congress and many other jurisdictions have identified as problematic. Current antitrust enforcement actions against big tech also run up against the problem of what remedy to request should the government prevail. How can agencies restore the lost competition? In the absence of prompt and effective remedies that create competition in platform markets, a good alternative is a set of rules that stimulates competition on dominant platforms. The apps, vendors, and other businesses that use these platforms are businesses that will not invest and invent unless they have a route to profitability. ICOA is quite conservative in that it aims to restore competition to digital markets that are concentrated or monopolized. The bill is fit for purpose and makes actionable only those violations that injure competition. The deference generally given to affirmative defenses in our current system, an undue deference in my opinion, very often, indicates that the law is very unlikely to penalize reasonable actions and quality products. The protect competition language in ICOA is new exactly because we know we have an antitrust enforcement problem. Using language drawn from the same ineffective jurisprudence we now use today would yield the same ineffective outcomes we have today, namely insufficient protection of competition. I expect it will take many years until we have a digital regulator, just as it took much human suffering before Congress chose to create regulators for industries like pharmaceuticals and railroads. Until we have such a regulator, the laws being proposed today are the best route to immediate improvements for the welfare of consumers. The pair of bills that we're discussing today reflect some of the content contained in the Digital Markets Act, which Senator Klobuchar referenced a few minutes ago, and which will take effect in Europe in January of 2024, less than 9 months away. Let me give you a few examples of the requirements in that law. Article 5, number 4, is anti-steering and an anti-gag rule. Gatekeepers shall allow business users to contract, communicate, promote, deliver various services bought elsewhere through the core platform. So this gives app developers much more freedom than they have today. Article 5, Item 7, prohibition on tying a platform with an in-app payment system. That gets freed up. Article 6, Item 2, prohibition of the use of non-public business user data to compete against the business users. Article 6, Item 4, an obligation to open operating systems to third-party apps and app stores. The gatekeeper shall allow and technically enable the installation and effective use of third-party software applications or software application stores. Article 6, number 5, the gatekeeper shall not treat more favorably in ranking and related indexing and crawling services and products offered by the gatekeeper itself than similar services or products of a third party. Article 6, Item 7, free interoperability, so free, no access charge, interoperability for business users, hardware and software, that is equivalent to the access enjoyed by the platform's own hardware or software. As you can see from this limited selection, the DMA is much more detailed than the text of ICOA or OAMA and does not include any efficiency defense. In particular, the DMA does not require that the regulator show that each instance of prohibited conduct harms competition. Instead, the rules were chosen to be those that, in the view of the European Parliament, would generally protect and increase competition. Platforms must be in compliance with these rules by 2024 in Europe. What does this mean for the bills we're discussing today? Right now, companies that seek to compete against today's dominant platforms or offer services through them will have an enormous incentive to focus their efforts in Europe, where they can bring new services, innovations, and lower prices to European consumers with these changes in the laws that give them more access, control, and innovative ability. American businesses and consumers will be able to read about these innovations, but they will need to go and launch a product in Europe themselves or visit on vacation to experience those products. The United States will miss out on opportunities to lead the world in tech sector innovation and experience the benefits that that innovation can deliver. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Next up, Chris Lewis. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Klobuchar, Ranking Member Lee, for the invitation to testify today. Public Knowledge is a nonprofit digital rights organization whose mission is to fight for an open internet, free expression, and affordable access to communications tools and creative works. And we see promoting robust competition online as a key part of that mission. Tech users are increasingly feeling like they have no power over tech giants online, and at times feel stuck with them. Big tech companies are popular for democratic speech they support, for the ease of purchasing products, and the communities that they foster. However, there is a distinct downside. Consumers don't know or understand how they are being tracked or influenced. Small businesses must accept unfair treatment in order to access consumers through the digital platform that dominate the internet. Their products can be unfairly demoted in search results, their ability to communicate with their customers can be limited, and their competitively sensitive business information can be misused. On social media, where so much of our modern political debate takes place, women, people of color, and other marginalized communities face harassment that pushes us out of the conversation. Radicalization pipelines on social media have offline consequences. Digital platforms are a distinct sector that need new laws and rules to address their power and protect users. Antitrust laws have an important role to play here, but existing antitrust law will not be sufficient. Here's a four-part framework that we've come up with for how I think we can best address the variety of policy challenges posed by dominant digital platforms. The first is the subject of this hearing, competition. We need sector-specific pro-competition legislation to empower consumers and business users by incentivizing market entry and facilitating switching to new platforms. Competition empowers customers to choose the option that is best for them. In many markets, that's the best price, but in digital platforms where the price is often $0, competition may happen along a variety of quality measures. Consumers might prefer to see fewer ads, more relevant search results, more reliable information, perhaps filtering tools or anti-harassment tools, or even more or less content moderation. The American Innovation and Choice Online Act, ACOA, and the Open Apps Market Act will make sure consumers are actually seeing the products that are best for them and not just products that are best for tech's bottom line. By taking away some of the key tools that big tech uses to stifle competitors and potential competitors online, fair competition rules like those found in ACOA and the Open Apps Market Act will also encourage new innovation to enter the market, since they'll know that they can have a fair shot to actually reach customers. Briefly, the other three parts of the framework are important as policymakers address sustainable solutions to meet consumers' needs. Part two is the importance of transparency so that consumers and business users can make informed choices. Transparency and due process practices paired with interoperability requirements can build trust and empower users when it comes to content moderation. Third, we need consumer protection laws and rules to address platform harms that won't be improved by competition. The first and most important of these will be a comprehensive privacy bill like the ADPPA, which we support. Everyone deserves to have their privacy respected. Lastly, these responsibilities should be housed in a new agency, an expert digital regulator. This regulator would work together with antitrust enforcers, not in lieu of antitrust enforcement. It would have competition, privacy, and other consumer protection authorities. It could also address content moderation concerns through transparency and due process requirements. And it could help carefully craft the future of algorithmic oversight and accountability. Given the bipartisan work of Congress over the past few years, we believe this framework can build a foundation for a better internet in the future. I know folks may disagree on some of the details of these legislative proposals, but we are happy to work with you and other stakeholders to find workable solutions. So thank you for inviting us here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Next up, Professor Francis.
Chair Klobuchar, Ranking Member Lee, members of the subcommittee, thanks for inviting me today. I'm a former federal antitrust enforcer, and I strongly support the subcommittee's focus on tech monopoly. Our digital markets are not competitive enough. Antitrust enforcement needs more money, building on the recent wonderful successes, and it needs updated statutes so that we can stop anti-competitive acquisitions and exclusionary practices in tech and other markets. And I would support platform rules that were targeted at specific practices that used market power in anti-competitive ways to harm consumers. But I don't recommend enacting either of these bills under discussion today. First, I don't support ICOA because I read it as telling platforms to do less for consumers and more for other businesses, some of which are going to turn out to be bad or harmful. Point one, ICOA makes it presumptively illegal to do many things that benefit consumers. Integrating functions like putting map information in search results, pre-installing apps like mail or maps on a phone, bundling services like music or movies in with Amazon Prime, those things shouldn't be even presumptively illegal. Point two, ICOA is going to discourage platforms from protecting users. There are plenty of bad actors, malicious apps, and junk out there on the internet, and today, platforms protect users by restricting access. But under ICOA, those access restrictions are going to mean a threat of serious hassle at best. Complaints, lengthy investigations, the threat of huge penalties and injunctions, and even the forfeiture of personal compensation by executives. And that threat's going to be bigger because so much of ICOA is vague. So it's going to be much less attractive for platforms to protect users than it is today. Now, that's going to mean that some good actors will get access to platforms and users, and that will be good. But more bad actors are going to get access too. They're going to be pre-installed on devices. They're going to be available in app stores. They're going to be available to choose as a default, given access to cameras and microphones and GPS information, and I think that's a much bigger harm. Point three, the affirmative defenses are much too weak. There's no defense here on the ground that what was restricted was just a bad product, or it was full of spam or intrusive advertising, or full of false or objectionable or sexually explicit content, or just too expensive to integrate. There is a product improvement defense, but it's only limited to core functions. If you improve a non-core function, it doesn't apply. And the defense doesn't apply at all if what you're doing could be done in a less discriminatory way, even if doing it that way would be unprofitable. And relying on the affirmative defense at all means spending time and money to prove it, risking penalties and injunctions and even the loss of your own salary if a court ends up disagreeing. So I think it's going to be a paper shield in practice. Point four, crucially, the bill doesn't define the central concept of harm to competition. It could mean either an antitrust-style consumer welfare test or injury to rivals. It can't possibly be both. And if it's the latter, then it's no limit at all. And if it's the former, which would allay a lot of my concerns, it must say so explicitly. Point five, and finally, ICOA is going to inject a ton of confusion into tech markets. It's full of terms and concepts that are new, important, broad, and undefined. And it's going to drown in complaints the very same agencies that today barely have the resources to cover their antitrust docket. I think that's the last thing they need. And I can imagine state attorneys general taking really different views in perfectly good faith about how ICOA should work, including how content moderation fits under sections 3A3 and 3A9 of the bill. Very briefly on the App Store bill, I think it's a much more promising basis for discussion. I would support rules for app stores that have significant market power, a ban on app price MFNs, a narrow ban on the competitive use of some data that preserve their right to use their own data and to buy it from developers. And I'd support a mandatory disclosure requirement when paid advertising leads to a search ranking boost. But forcing third-party app stores into digital ecosystem threatens real harm. The whole cybersecurity world, from the NSA and the FBI to the FTC, tell consumers and users to stay away from third-party app stores. I think the last thing we should do is lift those up. I don't think, even though I've been negative in my presentation, that there are any easy answers here, just really hard trade-offs and best guesses about what consequences are going to be. My instinct is that we do a lot better supporting and investing in the antitrust system that we've got, which so badly needs support. I think that's a better deal all around. Thanks for having me today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Next up, Professor Candide.
Madam Chair, Ranking Member Lee, and Senators, thank you for the chance to speak to you today. Big tech's market power undermines our nation's culture of vibrant...
Sorry, you have to turn your microphone on.
Big tech's market power undermines our nation's culture of vibrant democratic deliberation. Elon Musk's Twitter files demonstrated that big tech has indeed limited particular groups, including dissenters, from important government policies from full participation in national political discussions. This power to exclude threatens all Americans. Power to silence one group of Americans will be used sooner or later to silence another. Consider Parler. Beginning in 2021, the social media company, which differentiated itself from competitors by its free speech policies, was the most downloaded app on the Apple Play Store. But then on seemingly pretextual grounds, Apple removed Parler from the App Store, and soon after, Google removed it from the Play Store. Then Amazon Web terminated its hosting agreement. The Parler app was quite literally taken down. Only returning online months later, it never recovered its growth momentum. And this problem, the problem of big tech, stems from its market power, and not simply Silicon Valley's moral outlook that may differ from that of most Americans. As price givers, they dominate certain online business niches, and internet platforms can decrease service quality, silence viewpoints or perspectives without experiencing revenue loss. Competitive markets do not discipline their behavior. Antitrust addresses market power and presents to many, including myself, a dilemma. I stand on the side of markets and economic freedom, but at the same time cannot close my eyes to big tech's deleterious effects on the institutional resilience of our democracy, free speech, children's health and development, as well as quite possibly on economic innovation and growth. Antitrust has long recognized that special rules apply when dealing with market power deployed to stifle speech and free expression. The Supreme Court and Associated Press of the United States makes that point, and I quote, "The First Amendment, far from providing an argument against the application of the Sherman Act, here provides powerful reasons to the contrary. That amendment rests on the assumption that the widest possible dissemination of information from diverse and antagonistic sources is essential to the welfare of the public." So from my perspective, I ask whether the Open Apps Market Act and ICOA further a freer country, a stronger democracy, as well as a more vital and innovative online economy. The open apps market is a solid attempt to combat the power of the large app distributors, but can be strengthened. As written, it's not clear that it would solve the Parler problem. There is no unreasonable discrimination provision that prohibits arbitrary deplatforming. Further, Section 4's exceptions allow platforms to exclude or deplatform apps to further digital safety. As a law professor who specializes in communications law, I confess I never heard the term until I read it in the bill. What does digital safety mean? Don't text and drive? Don't charge your iPhone while using it in the bathtub? Alas, no. Digital safety is a concept pushed and likely coined by the World Economic Forum and its Global Coalition on Digital Safety. The WF defines digital unsafe content as, I quote, lawful but awful. As the Twitter files show, employees of the major platforms have notions of what constitutes awful, which probably do not align with what the Davos crowd considers awful, and which are probably quite contrary to American traditions of free expression. As for ICOA, its sponsors should be congratulated for forwarding the issue of restoring competition in digital markets. I do have a few reservations. ICOA may simply be ineffective at promoting free speech. With no private cause of action, it is a very big stick, really a club, that DOJ, the FTC, and the state attorney generals can use to hit big tech. As was observed in the opening comments, government power over big tech often can have a bad effect on free speech. ICOA, with its open-ended terms and discretionary and exclusive government enforcement, adds to the available pressure government can employ on the major internet platforms to silence government's critics. I welcome the committee's questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Amanda Lewis. Thank you for being here.
Chairwoman Klobuchar and Ranking Member Lee, thank you for the invitation to testify. I am here in my personal capacity and not on behalf of any client. Last Congress showed strong bipartisan support for antitrust reform, especially for bills that would curb big tech's and big pharma's monopoly power. There is a lot of common ground here. This committee advanced ACOA and the Open App Markets Act on a bipartisan basis. You deserve credit for doing so. Enforcers, as well as private plaintiffs, are currently seeking relief in court to address some of the gatekeeper platforms' anti-competitive conduct. But the unique challenges of digital markets, plus the time and resource-intensive nature of litigation, make this an inefficient and also possibly ineffective tool for the job. Under current law, the deck is stacked in favor of the platforms. And that is why Congress should pass legislation to rein in the dominant digital platforms and restore competition to our digital markets. ACOA is a comprehensive and well-thought-out bill. It draws support from a long list of consumer groups, businesses, and labor unions. It counts both NFIB and the Teamsters as strong supporters. An example will help identify just a few concrete benefits of the bill. ACOA would prohibit Amazon from tying, which forces third-party sellers to pay enormous fees to Amazon for services that they don't actually want to buy. By prohibiting this conduct, ACOA will restore dignity and autonomy to businesses that have no choice but to rely on Amazon. Independent businesses will cease to be puppets with Amazon pulling the strings. Consumers will also benefit when sellers are no longer forced to pay junk fees to Amazon that effectively add up to a 50% commission on every sale. Sellers will undoubtedly pass those savings on to consumers. And this is just one example of many of the benefits of ACOA. The Open App Markets Act is much narrower. It's focused on the mobile app ecosystem. If OAMA is passed, consumers will see immediate savings as well. When Apple can no longer force a 30% commission on developers for payment services that should cost a fraction of that. OAMA would also force Apple to give consumers the same freedoms that they enjoy on their desktop and laptop computers. The freedom to download the software and services of their choosing. This would put the power back where it belongs, not in the hands of the dominant platforms, but in the hands of consumers. Finally, OAMA will restore the incentive to innovate for app developers. When innovators are no longer afraid that Apple will effectively steal their ideas and hard-won customers, they will take more risks and invest in new ideas. An increased sense of security will encourage the investment of capital in the innovation economy. After this committee's hard work to study the problems and the solutions, these bills are ready to become law. I urge Congress to move quickly to pass both ACOA and OAMA. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our witnesses. I'll get started here. We have a number of senators with us. I'll start with you, Professor Scott Morton. I was interested to see already the 2,800 lawyers and lobbyists for the companies are now claiming that one of my points was that we should cede regulation to, that I said we should cede regulation to Europe and to Australia and to South Korea. They're already at it. I think you know what I said, which was that we should take the lead. We in America who believe in competition should take the lead, and that we have some good examples out there, but we shouldn't let them take the lead. So I just thought for those of you tweeting that out, you might be interested to note that that was a lie. Professor Scott Morton, could you please talk about and kind of refute some of the points that Professor Francis made when it comes to the bill, and how the bill is all about capitalism and competition. And as you know, throughout history, that has been a counterweight to monopolies.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. I think the parade of horribles that was listed by Professor Francis really can't happen if there's a requirement to find injury to competition. Today's courts are actually really happy to find behaviors that economists would identify as harmful to competition to be fine. The problem we have is actually excessive deference to that kind of an argument. And I think, therefore, it's natural we would have some of that here despite the beefed-up language. So the notion that courts will suddenly eliminate quality products because they have to evaluate a harm to competition is, I think, misplaced. And the kind of self-preferencing that the bill is worried about can be harmful. This is known. It's not an imaginary thing, and Professor Francis has himself written that self-preferencing isn't captured by the antitrust laws, the current antitrust laws. So what kind of self-preferencing would we worry about? What kind would be harmful? The kind that harms competition. So again, we're returning to familiar economic concepts. This is all stuff that we know from the literature. And the fact that new words are being used in this legislation is exactly to ensure that we get a new outcome. We can't use the same terminology and imagine that courts won't understand it the way they always have. So to get a different outcome, we have to use a new word and say, look, we're worried about harm to competition. In terms of innovation, I think, as I said in my opening remarks, the entrenched monopolists that we have right now should not be relied on to generate innovation. That's not what a monopolist does. It's safe. It doesn't have to run fast to innovate. Where we're seeing quite a lot of innovation is actually on these platforms now. So the apps themselves competing with each other and trying to innovate and indeed someday replace the platform.
Okay.
That gets limited without protections.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Lewis, we have two Lewises. I'll start with you, Ms. Lewis. This committee, I found your testimony very interesting and compelling about the small businesses. And I think we have previously heard from them. Their group, the NFIB, is strongly in support of this bill. And many of them have told us they're afraid to come forward individually because they're afraid of retaliation by the platforms. And we've seen this before because they can go out of business if they're retaliated against. You work with companies who are stuck in this position. How would the American Innovation and Choice Online Act help them?
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. The fear of retaliation is significant and really overwhelming for many market participants. It is something that I encountered during the House Judiciary Committee digital markets investigation, and have continued to experience in private practice. It's one of the reasons why I co-founded the Responsible Online Commerce Coalition, because small businesses like Amazon third-party sellers are terrified of the degree to which Amazon has complete control over their economic livelihood and the power to essentially eliminate it overnight. The ACOA very helpfully explicitly prohibits retaliation when businesses of all sizes and individuals too, I believe, raise concerns about these platforms' anti-competitive conduct, and that is a key provision, and I applaud you for that.
Thank you. Last question, Mr. Lewis. How do you think the bill will affect the strength and competitiveness of U.S. Tech companies?
Senator, I think it will affect it directly. Too many small companies rely on these platforms for access to consumers, and so it's important that they have the ability to reach consumers without having to ask for permission. It's important that they feel free to innovate without fear of their business data being manipulated by the dominant digital platforms. So most of the folks that we talked to, folks that were studied in the House antitrust investigation, folks who don't always want to come forward and share their fears, will say privately that it's important that they have the ability to compete, that they feel restricted by the practices of the dominant digital platforms, and I feel like ACOA specifically targets the harms that we saw studied in the House Antitrust Subcommittee.
Thank you very much. And I just think it's really important to note, as Ms. Lewis was talking about the momentum for the bill, we have had major breakthroughs, including the NFIB endorsement since it started, and these things take a long time. The more and more small businesses that I think that these platforms took for granted that are coming out and talking about what's happening, and including medium-sized businesses and the like, I think it's really important that we note that kind of momentum that we've had in terms of a change of the support that we're getting for this bill as more people understand what's really going on, which in this ecosystem and what's going on around the world. Senator Lee.
Thank you. Professor Francis, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. I share many of the concerns that have been expressed by colleagues. That self-preferencing by dominant digital platforms may, in some circumstances, harm competition. But I'm also concerned that the broad, vague language used in ICOA could actually prohibit some conduct that's pro-competitive as well. Do you share this concern? And if so, can you elaborate?
Very much, Senator. So the bill makes central, as a limiting principle, the concept of harm to competition. And that's going to mean one of two things: either antitrust-style consumer welfare or injury to rivals or competitors. And the bill inexplicably leaves that vacant. Professor Scott Morton is exactly right. Antitrust does have a concept of competitive harm, not exactly the statutory language that ICOA has chosen, but consumer welfare, the use of market power to make consumers or trading partners or workers worse off overall. It's a harm requirement. And if ICOA said that, then my written testimony would have been much shorter and my concerns would have been allayed, but it doesn't. It could just mean injury to competitors, and that's what creates these terrible dangers.
Thank you. That's helpful. Professor Kanjub, as I've mentioned, censorship isn't necessarily itself an antitrust problem, but market power can certainly enable, and in some cases markedly exacerbate, censorship. And I think that we need to deal with the censorship issue head on its own terms, which is why I'm preparing to introduce legislation that would prevent social media companies from acting as censor in private communications between one person and another, and would require them to be transparent and offer due process to their users when moderating public content, while still allowing for the removal of illegal and pornographic content. Do you believe such a bill would be helpful?
Very much, Senator. As noted, OAMA doesn't really directly address the issue of deplatforming individuals. You could sort of read into it in one of the sections that it perhaps provides some protection, but it doesn't have direct language saying that the platform shall not engage in unreasonable discrimination. Similarly, ICOA protects business users, but not user users. So I think that legislation that sets that forth would be a real step forward and would help Americans.
Okay, let's go back to ICOA for a minute. Professor Francis, ICOA supporters have pointed out, they'll point to the requirement that in many sections, conduct has to result in harm to competition. Does this alleviate any of your concerns?
It doesn't, Senator, and I think there's a real risk that a court looking at this bill will say, gosh, it's pretty clear that this was intended to signal a departure from the antitrust standard. Number one, this conversation is being had right now as part of the legislative process, and so failing to answer that pretty strongly suggests that there isn't a clear answer that can be written into the bill. This is not itself going to be an antitrust statute. It doesn't use antitrust statutory language. So Section 7 of the Clayton Act, for example, talks about a merger being illegal if its effect may be substantially to lessen competition. That's not language that's followed here. And there's nothing in ICOA that says harm to competition shall be interpreted compatibly with antitrust. So this looks like a different kind of bill doing different kind of work that very intentionally is going a different way from traditional antitrust, including because of political and other concerns about antitrust's consumer welfare standard itself. So I think failing to answer that question on the face of the bill is very dangerous.
Okay, so by leaving these important terms vague and undefined, are they giving the game away? giving the game away, and that this would end up being a bill about protecting competitors, not competition or not consumers, right?
I don't think there can be any room for doubt that if harm to competition in this statute is read to mean injury to rivals or injury to competitors, it would be terribly anti-consumer in its operation.
And can that be remedied without an adequate narrowing of the term, eliminating the vagueness in the terminology?
I can't think of an alternative, Senator, to saying, and it's a short and simple provision if this is really the purpose of the measure, to say that harm to competition means injury to consumer welfare, or I'm not wedded to the terminology if something else like overall harm to consumers and workers, but something that incorporates the concept, I think is critical to ensure that it doesn't do a terrible amount of unintended harm.
And yet this concept is not foreign to our competition policy. It's not foreign to antitrust law. This is pretty well-worn stuff, right?
Exactly as Professor Scott Morton says, that's what antitrust typically means when it says harm to competition. Now, it can be hard in some cases to figure out whether a harmful static effect like a price increase can really be outbalanced by a beneficial dynamic benefit like greater innovation. So there can be difficulties in applying it, but everybody understands in antitrust that we're concerned with overall consumer welfare effects. And that's the question that's going to be asked of this statute.
Thank you. See, my time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Lee. Next up is Senator Durbin, our chair. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Madam Chairman. Senator Klobuchar, I want to thank you and Ranking Member Lee for holding this hearing. My observation in general is that the pace of change in the digital markets is lightning fast and evolving every day. My observation, based on many decades of working on Capitol Hill, is that the response of our government is painfully slow, often understaffed and underinformed, and usually sailing against the wind of vested interest. Doesn't make a very easy situation for us to respond to in a thoughtful way. I look back when I served in the House and we passed a communications bill about 30 years ago and somehow left out the word internet. And I would think as we reflect on the state of the digital market today and wonder how we're going to solve the problem, if smarter people, or at least more people, are thinking about ways to avoid any kind of regulation or restraint, aren't going to get the best of us again. How can we avoid this? Open question.
Does someone want to chime in? Mr. Lewis?
I'll take a stab at it, Senator. Senator, I think this is why, first of all, I agree with your assessment of the challenge for Congress to keep up with regulating a fast-moving sector. Like the Communications Act, which you referenced, I think it's a long-term solution is to look at empowering a regulator who has the expertise in the technology, like the FCC has in telecommunications, to be nimble, to be careful, to be analytical in the duties that Congress charges it with to protect consumers, to protect competition, and other harms, and with the proper oversight from Congress. So we believe that's a critical part of protecting consumers online. I know it's not the exact focus of this hearing, looking at specific competition bills, but I think added with the principles and ideas in these competition bills could be part of a real long-term solution. And your point about not having the internet in the Telecommunications Act points to what I believe was the wisdom of Congress. The Telecommunications Act does give the FCC authority over communications over wire and radio. What else do we think the internet is? It's communications going over wire and radio. Sometimes it's a fiber optic wire, sometimes it's radio signal to a mobile device. This is why we've advocated for authority over broadband at the FCC, but that's a different topic.
But if we're dealing with digital markets so overwhelming in size, Amazon commanding 40% of the e-commerce market in the United States, 6 times its nearest competitor. Google controls 93% of online searches. Apple holds tight grip on 120 million plus iPhone users. Do we really think the Federal Trade Commission is up to the challenge? Mr. Lewis, or whoever else
I'm
wants
happy to address that.
Mr. Lewis.
As somebody who's a former employee enforcer at the FTC, and I know I'm not alone in that, as Professor Francis was also a former FTC enforcer. I absolutely think that the FTC and the DOJ are up to the task of applying the laws that we're discussing today, should they become law, ACOA and OAMA, to these markets. More expertise is certainly better. Being more informed is better, but I believe strongly that the FTC and the DOJ, as they stand today, do have the tools and the ability to get the expertise that they need to address the problematic conduct in digital markets. However, I'll say that they have the ability, but I'll correct myself, they don't have the tools, because, and that is where ACOA and OAMA come in. Current antitrust law is not well suited to address the problems that we're seeing, the abuse of these dominant platforms' market power. So these bills are really necessary, but I'll also add that the ACOA is a bill that I think did a lot of hard work. I think the sponsors did a lot of hard work to future-proof the bill. So it is specific enough that it gives guidance to the agencies and the courts, but also leaves room to adapt to future conditions.
Well, I just want to close by saying that no reflection at all on the senator from Minnesota who has led this charge and revitalized this issue of antitrust debate to a level that I have not seen in many, many years, and I think it's long overdue. But I think the challenge for us is to make sure there is an agency with the authority and the resources and the political support to get the job done. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, very good. Thank you, Senator Durbin. I would note through the work that Senator Grassley and I did and Senator Lee last year, the merger fee bill that passed 88 with 88 senators, along with the venue bill of Senator Lee's as an amendment, is going to amount to $1 billion to these agencies. As Professor Francis, he and I agree on this, on the resources, and what you're referring to, Ms. Lewis, that is a significant increase. While we'd like to see more, it's a significant increase, not on the backs of taxpayers, to help these agencies to do their work. Okay, next up, Senator Grassley.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My first question is to Professor Morton, Mr. Lewis, and Ms. Lewis. In your testimony, you expressed support for the American Online Innovation Choice Act, how it deals with the digital market abuses. You've just heard a testimony by Professor Francis and Professor Kandub expressing a number of concerns with the bill. So I'd like to have the three of you briefly explain why you agree or disagree with Professor Kandub and Francis.
Thank you, Senator. I think that the digital platforms we have today have quite a bit of entrenched market power. When Senator Durbin said technology moves fast, yeah, it moves fast, but think of how many years we've been using Google search, getting onto Facebook.com, having an Android operating system. These platforms have been around for some time now. And that's because we haven't been able to use current antitrust laws effectively to create competition in this space. So we need an additional tool. And if a few words describing the competition, what competition means, is going to make this law pass for Professor Francis, then I think we're done. I mean, we've got problems, and we need solutions to those problems. A general purpose antitrust statute would also be good, but because the problems in digital platforms are somewhat unique to them and they're so entrenched, I think we need a particular tool, and this statute would be that.
Mr. Lewis, if you got something to add.
I agree. I think the ACOA is very specific in the anti-competitive harms that it's trying to solve, issues of self-preferencing, issues of tying, issues of control of data. And so I think the specificity that Mr. Francis is looking for is in the bill. Regarding the concerns about free expression is a core value for my organization. I believe that ACOA specifically targets anti-competitive harms, and I don't believe that content moderation on a platform, a single platform, is necessarily an anti-competitive harm. Discrimination.
You have other platforms to choose from.
Well, you do. Discrimination looks different on every platform, but the internet has infinite channels. And by promoting competition, we're giving users a choice of platforms to go to. And I know there's going to be another hearing on content moderation in the future. I think that's the proper place where if folks are concerned with too much or too little content moderation to address those concerns specifically. But this bill dealing with any competitive harms has a secondary impact that by promoting competitive choices lets users vote with their feet and go elsewhere if they don't like the moderation choices that they're given on a specific platform. So I don't think it's restrictive at all, and I don't find those choices to moderate content to be anti-competitive.
So,
Lewis?
thank you. So I do not agree with Professor Francis's analysis here. And I also, in terms of, there was a suggestion that adding consumer welfare, those words, into the statute of ACOA would be a good thing. I disagree with that. Consumer welfare is not a word that appears in any of our antitrust statutes and can be interpreted to be extremely narrow and refer only to harms from price. Now, certainly in digital markets, the harms go far beyond price to privacy and other non-price dimensions. So codifying that, I think, would be a mistake. I also find it interesting that Professor Francis has said that the current antitrust laws is what we should work with and what we should invest in. Those laws, those statutes, are extremely vague, very short. And the language that was used in those antitrust statutes, well, that was new language when those laws were passed. Because it was using a new phrase, does that mean we shouldn't have passed those laws? So I think that what I see as a somewhat unfounded fear of courts interpreting harm to competition in a way that would prohibit pro-competitive conduct, I don't think that is a good reason to oppose this bill.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Senator Grassley, for your work on the bill on the merger fees, but also for being the lead sponsor on the bill that we're talking about today. And I will note the hearing you referred to, Mr. Lewis, is actually going to be chaired by Senator Blumenthal, the Section 230 hearing with Senator Hawley, I believe, coming up tomorrow. So we're on top of things. Okay. Next up is Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman Klobuchar, and let me start with a particular welcome to Ms. Lewis. As a friend, colleague, and admirer of David Cicilline's, I'm very glad that you are here, and thank you for his work supporting the efforts of the House Judiciary Committee. I have two questions, and given the short period of time, I would invite specifically Ms. Scott Morton, Mr. Lewis, and Ms. Lewis to answer as questions for the record, but given that we'll have a little bit of time, I invite you to jump in. The two questions are, first, we have the EU's Digital Markets Act coming on, and I'm interested in what effect you see that having in this marketplace and what lessons we should take from the effect of that law in this marketplace. Presumably, the minimum conclusion one could draw is that you can legislate in this space and not break everything. But I'd be interested in your views about that. And the second, to the point suggested just now by Chairman Klobuchar, is how do you see Section 230 as problematic or helpful in this space? And I'll flag my bias. I think it's problematic. I think a lot of these problems would have sorted themselves out a lot earlier if these industries weren't protected from several centuries of legal tradition that govern human behavior. So
I'll just jump in on the DMA quickly and
Please.
say that it's going to be very interesting for the United States to see how platforms respond to the DMA, because there will be some instances, I imagine, where it's easier, more cost-effective to have one business model and run it globally, in which case the changes made to comply with the DMA will be taken advantage of by American consumers and businesses.
we see
I
that
can
in
also-
automobiles when California
Correct.
puts its standards out. Nobody
Exactly.
makes two cars.
Exactly. But there will be other cases where, look, if the platform can run an exploitative model in the United States and a competitive one in Europe, and they make more money doing that, then they'll choose to do that. And so we're going to see those kinds of choices, as well as then be able to learn from the smoothness or lack thereof, or new products or lack thereof, as to what are the most effective rules.
And who do you expect most effectively to look at that behavior and draw lessons from it in the U.S. government?
In the U.S. government? I don't know. I mean, the European Commission is going to get reports from platforms and confidential information on what's changed and what they're doing. I don't know that we have any way to study it in the U.S. government
Do you think
that
the
I'm aware
FCC
of.
would be up to the task of looking at that?
Would who?
The FCC?
That would be a great idea. Ask them to write a report. Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Lewis?
Senator, you asked about Section 230.
Yeah.
While we're very supportive of these efforts to promote competition, I think Section 230 and the issues around it are a different issue. Section 230 was crafted to support the use of the creation of third-party content online. Both the choice to moderate it and the choice not to moderate it. And I think it's an essential protection that, combined with smart competition policy, actually gives folks choices to express themselves freely on whatever platform they choose to, based on the moderation practices that that platform uses. I think transparency of those moderation practices is important. I think due process is important, but it's.
I guess you and I are going to disagree on that.
We might disagree.
Ms. Lewis?
Thank you. So you asked what lesson could be learned from the enactment of the DMA. I think one important lesson is what you referenced, is we see that you can pass legislation here to rein in the dominant digital platforms and stop the abuse of their market power over businesses and consumers. And you can do that without breaking these products and services that consumers love. These two things are in no way mutually exclusive. And so we are already seeing, or at least it is reported, for example, that Apple, who said if we pass OAMA, we're gonna break the iPhone and the App Store system, well, and create problems for users in terms of safety and security. Well, it turns out, at least it's reported, that in Europe, in order to comply with the DMA, that they are preparing to allow for alternative app stores. So how is it that, it's interesting that they say here, last Congress, to U.S. members, oh, you cannot pass this law, it will break the product, it will break the phone. And then there are reports that they're voluntarily agreeing to make these changes. I will say not purely voluntarily, because it's in response to the law. And if we want to see similar benefits for U.S. consumers and businesses, then I think we similarly need to pass legislation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that excellent point, Ms. Lewis. I just don't think they're going to, if we're just going to wait and let Europe have the benefits for 10, 15 years, they're not going to do it unless we start moving. And then maybe they'll negotiate with us. Okay, next up, Senator Blumenthal, who knows a little bit about this topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you for your profoundly persistent and courageous work in this area. Thanks to our ranking member as well. I'm very proud to be working with you on a number of these bills, including your American Innovation and Choice Online Act, which does far more than just stop self-preferencing. It is very, very potentially significant. And my Open App Markets Act, the reference was made earlier to Section 230. Yes, we are having a hearing tomorrow, Judiciary Committee hearing. The Tech and Privacy Subcommittee, Senator Hawley and I are going to be exploring potential reforms to Section 230. But let me just begin with the comment that Senator Klobuchar just made. If we wait for big tech to reform itself, we're going to be old men and women. We may not be around to see anything happen. And to the point about content moderation, let's be very clear. Big tech has an abysmal record on civil rights and safety. It helped foster and fuel racial discrimination, threats, and privacy violations that have a material and costly impact on people's real lives. These behemoth corporations are not protectors of vulnerable communities, nor of free expression. So if we wait for them to do that as well, we just are not going to see it. There is an elephant in the room, which is big tech's response to this legislation. And I'm not speaking for Senator Klobuchar, just for myself. I would say it's an unprecedented smear campaign, a disinformation strategy. One of the elements of that disinformation campaign is to say it's a dire threat to cybersecurity and privacy. As anybody who's read our measures, both of our measures knows, we take specific steps. We insert very explicit provisions, which big tech says need to be much broader, trying to create loopholes and exceptions that swallow the rule. I wonder, Professor Scott Morton, whether you would describe, you allude to some of them in your testimony, and I know you're not a lawyer. I always think of you as a lawyer because you know so much more law than most of us on the Judiciary Committee, speaking, again, just for myself. But you're also a very astute and learned economist. I wonder if you could talk about how those exceptions provide for privacy and security.
Thank you, Senator. I always get a warm welcome from the senator from Connecticut, which I appreciate. The important safeguards in these bills, I think, are doing exactly what you say. It would be counterintuitive to have a bill that's going to promote consumers' welfare and have there be dangerous products, and therefore we want to give the platforms the ability to control that. And there are many ways to do that, and it is in the platform's interest to do that, because if you want to attract users to your platform, you want it to be safe and a good experience. So I just see no reason why, with all the technological capability these platforms have, they can't design the product to be safe. And given that both bills allow them to do that, I'm really thinking that American ingenuity is going to make this work out just fine.
Thank you. Ms. Lewis, you made the comment just now that Apple may be developing a system to enable apps access to their phones in Europe, but I'm not sure we can count on those products being available here. Shouldn't Americans have as much access to competition, fair play, innovation as European consumers?
Senator Blumenthal, I agree with you 100%. And it is just critical that American businesses and consumers can benefit from the increased choice in terms of alternative app distribution, and this would likely result in not only cost savings for consumers, but also spur innovation and growth among U.S. companies. And so it is U.S. consumers, and it is also U.S. businesses, as the U.S. economy does not just consist of these four dominant platforms. And so if we want to see the economy thrive and our consumers benefit from competition, then legislation must be passed in the United States to do that.
I'm at the end of my time. I have a bunch of other questions, but I just want to thank all the members of the panel for being here today. And your last comment, these measures are really pro-business. Maybe they're not pro-monopolist or pro-predatory conduct, but they are pro-business. And as complicated as it seems, the internet befuddles a lot of people. Think of it in terms of the old days of the railroads. If the railroads had said, you can only run our boxcars with only our manufactured goods because we control the rails, you didn't need any smoke-filled rooms to know that was going to be anti-consumer and anti-business. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Blumenthal. Someone else who knows a lot about this and has been a leader in this area, Senator Hirono, is with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's good to be on the subcommittee, and I thank the ranking member also. It's been really challenging to do anything to regulate these very powerful digital platforms. So the ICOA bill, when we start talking about making changes to Section 230, it's just been almost hellacious, I'd say. So I think, Professor Scott Morton, you said something along the lines of the current antitrust laws have not been particularly effective in regulating digital platforms. Did I hear you correctly that you said something along those lines?
Yes, I did.
Mr. Lewis, do you agree with that kind of characterization of the current antitrust laws?
Yes.
So would ICOA, which is, I think, pretty specific in what it wants to do, would it help to have a law like that which is much more specific than the current antitrust laws?
In my opinion, it would, and that's because the current antitrust laws have requirements such as defining relevant markets and predicting but-for outcomes that turn out to be quite challenging in fast-moving digital markets. And if Congress wants better enforcement here, I think it's very helpful to give more explicit instructions to courts on how to get there.
Mr. Lewis, did you want to add something?
Just the thought that these are often referred to as antitrust bills, but they're very specific in the prohibited conduct, and that part of what we've seen in the weakness of the current antitrust laws is just how they've been interpreted. And so I think there are ways in which, with cases brought that challenge monopoly under the current antitrust laws, to look at different ways to think about the power of monopoly. But this specific bill, ICOA, I think adds just more tools to the toolbox for those antitrust enforcers.
Well, back in the day when the Sherman Act and Clayton Acts were passed, and yes, we have decades of interpretation of both of these laws, but nobody predicted that we would have these kinds of hugely powerful digital platforms that millions of people use, and basically there's very little apparently that we can do to make sure that consumers are protected. And so, Mr. Lewis, you mentioned that public knowledge has called repeatedly for a new competition promoting expert regulator for digital platforms. And I think that is acknowledging that maybe we need a whole new kind of legal framework for regulating digital platforms. So Can you just explain a little bit more about what you had in mind with that proposal?
Sure. The idea of an expert digital regulator is to complement antitrust enforcement, not to replace it. And a regulator, we think, would have authority over consumer protection, authority over or involvement with competition harms and concerns. My background is in telecommunications. We're impressed with the relationship between the FCC and the antitrust enforcers, where they work together when looking at mergers, when looking at, with a different standard at the public interest harms. And so an expert digital regulator would be able to do that to address things that can't be dealt with through competition policy. I think it could be structured in a number of different ways. It could be an existing agency. It could be a new agency. There's interesting proposals out there from Senator Bennett and Senator Welch that we're interested in, supportive of. It's a challenge to set up, but I think taking the time to look through the harms that you want an agency to address and giving them the proper authority to do so and the resources to do so, I think would help Congress.
My time is running out. Thank you. Ms. Scott Morton, would you agree that perhaps a new kind of agency or a person or two to be focused on consumer harms and the public interest?
Yes, I do. It's what we normally do in the United States. We invent airplanes. We have an airplane regulator. We invent trains. We have a train regulator. We invent drugs. We have a drug regulator. There's no regulator for digital, and there's a lot of problems as a result. So I agree.
I agree with you. Thank you for talking about that. And Ms. Lewis, you noted that the DMA that Europe has passed, the companies are able to make the appropriate adjustments. So there's nothing to say that we can't pass something that is, the ICOA is narrower than the DMA, isn't it, in its focus?
To give you a more complete answer, I would want to get back to you in writing, but I think the DMA is narrow, the ACOA is narrower, and I have done a comparison of that.
Oh, thank you. We would appreciate having that, but the world is not going to come to an end because Europe passed the DMA. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Next up, Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and particularly want to thank you for your leadership on these issues. I think it's vitally important, not just for the innovators and investors and entrepreneurs, but for consumers and workers and the overall health of our economy, that we have an open and innovative and competitive technology sector. So I hope we can continue to work closely together this Congress to build upon the great work that has already been done to better identify market failures and areas of under-enforcement, and to develop more precise legislative remedies to specifically address the issues that we're facing. Now, during the committee's consideration last year of the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, I expressed concerns that provisions of the bill may open the covered platforms to either lawsuits or even threats of lawsuits for decisions they made to enforce their content moderation policies against hate speech, misinformation, and other content that they may want to not host. And several academics, nonprofit groups, and other senators actually voiced similar concerns. And even supporters of the bill approached my office with differing opinions. I was told by some supporters that no such problems existed, while other supporters told me that, yes, the concerns raised were indeed valid. Question for Professor Francis: should we be concerned about the bill's unintended impacts on platform content moderation, and is this an area where the bill can be improved through additional clarity?
I think so, Senator. I'm certainly not an expert on either the practices or the law of content moderation, but as I read this bill from the perspective of an antitrust person thinking about what compliance would look like, I look at two things, and they both give me the concern you've just articulated. So one is Section 3A3 of the bill, which prohibits discrimination with respect to the application or enforcement of terms of service in favor of business users against similarly situated business users. Now, as I read it, that would include content moderation of various kinds that a court ultimately concluded, or even a state attorney general alleged, was discriminatory. And then we look at our affirmative defenses. ICOA provides no defense on the ground that what was restricted was spam, was supplying false or objectionable content, nothing in there that one might plausibly identify with content moderation. So regardless of how one feels about the optimal content moderation law, this very sharply raises the question but doesn't answer it. And to my mind, what that means is litigation, threats of litigation, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of deterrent effect running in ways we almost certainly don't want.
Well, the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, as we discussed and debated in the committee last year, attempts to address several market problems at once. However, I worry that in doing so, it may inadvertently do harm to products and services that consumers actually enjoy. For example, in broadly and presumptively making unlawful the preferencing of a platform's own products, services, or lines of business, is it possible that basic and convenient features of integrated products and services that consumers enjoy and benefit from would be prohibited and subject to unnecessary and perhaps chilling scrutiny? Professor Francis, I'll let you go first here.
I completely share that concern. So things that would constitute self-preferencing cover an array of things that are clearly great for consumers, integrating functions like map results in search, or better integrating your own voice assistant because you found a way to do that, pre-installing apps or features on a device without doing that for the whole world, bundling services together, or even in order to create a more secure and seamless experience, just say, hey, we're going to have a closed system on this part of our platform where we're not going to have third-party participation. All of that stuff is self-preferencing, and then the whole game is whether or not there's harm to competition. Number one, that term is central and undefined. If nothing else, that is a ton of uncertainty, and the prospect of being dragged through investigations, litigations, injunctions, huge penalties, and even having executives' personal compensation taken away, that's going to deter a lot of behavior that we would want to see from platforms that they'd otherwise do.
Okay. Well, I'll just conclude with this, Madam Chair, because I still agree with the stated objective here of our legislative efforts, but I want to continue to work with you and the experts here to make sure that we're getting it right. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Professor Francis, you said you were not an expert on the content moderation, so I'm going to turn to some people that I think could shed some light on it, but I appreciated your answers. Ms. Lewis and Mr. Lewis, we'll turn to the two Lewises here. Could you talk about what this bill is about, the American Innovation and Choice Online Act? And I'll start with you, Ms. Lewis. Whether or not the bill would have impact on the speech rights of anyone on a covered platform. I point out that Senator Grassley and I worked to ensure that the bill is focused solely on addressing digital platform competition issues. But that, of course, hasn't stopped the bill's opponents from raising dubious arguments related to free speech. And so I thought you, Ms. Lewis, might want to address that. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Unfortunately, I think that this debate over content moderation, or sort of the critiques that are aimed at ACOA, are a divisive distraction. In my view, the ACOA does not impact content moderation. It does not make it harder for a gatekeeper platform to engage in content moderation, and it does not make it easier for the digital gatekeeper to engage in content moderation. The bill simply has nothing to do with it. And in terms of the idea that certain things may be, you mentioned the word dubious, and the idea that certain things may be possible. I would not even concede that it's possible, but let's say it is possible that a state AG or could interpret the bill in that way. I don't think it's plausible, and I don't think when we think about sort of very unlikely things that could occur and possible far-fetched outcomes, I think we should be thinking about what is plausible rather than what is improbable and unlikely. Again, in summary, ACOA does not affect content moderation.
Thank you. Senator Padilla had to leave, but we will convey your testimony to him. Mr. Lewis, do you want to answer that as well?
I guess what I would add, because I agree with Ms. Lewis, what I would add is just the language in the bill is so specific. Mr. Francis keeps pointing to the competition harm phrase, but I think it's very important that the Attorney General, the federal antitrust official would have to go to court and make a case for what is materially harming competition in the practice of the platform. And so I don't read that phrase as referring to content moderation. But if someone wants to bring that case, they would have to point to what that practice is. Simply limiting someone's content that they posted online, I don't see how that hurts competition when there's so many places where you can post online and folks can create their own websites. There's great opportunity to speak. So proving that case just seems very hard. I think that's what Ms. Lewis means by impractical.
We also note that the Attorney General, the Justice Department supports this bill as well. So, Mr. Lewis, again, kind of changing topics here. Numerous reports have suggested that Amazon creates knockoffs. These are, Wall Street Journal stories and the like of third-party sellers' products and uses its algorithm to give its own brands an advantage. A recent study by economists at the National Bureau of Economic Research found that Amazon-branded products are ranked higher than observably similar products in consumer search results on Amazon's platform. How do these practices affect competition and the incentives of small businesses to create new innovative products? And how can some common sense rules of the road, maybe you want to start with this, help protect small businesses to compete against these mammoth companies?
Right. I think the rules in ACOA go a long way to protect those practices. The difference between a marketplace, an online marketplace like Amazon, and a brick and mortar marketplace are very different. The ability to control data, to see all the data that's coming in about sales, about the products, the limited space and the control of that space where products are seen is just very different. The scope and scale of an online marketplace is just wholly different from what we see in brick and mortar. And so having these sort of specific rules protecting the small businesses and the products that they want to bring to that market, since it's one of their few choices that they have to reach consumers, is critically important.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll ask you this. Looks like, Ms. Lewis, you want to say something, but I want to just very quickly.
Yes. So I think the self-preferencing that you just mentioned is a perfect example of what can be anti-competitive self-preferencing. And so you have the situation where Amazon is putting its thumb on the scale to distort competition. And that's the situation where third-party sellers who may come up with new ideas or have quality, high quality, maybe better quality products are not being able to compete on the merits of their goods and services, their goods in this case.
All right, and then I just want to make, you mentioned these conflicting statements, and if you could just quickly mention this, I think this is so important. We made it clear in the bill that it would not impact subscription-based services like Amazon Prime. despite Amazon's claims. And I noticed these lying pop-up ads that I've shown to my colleagues because that's what they're done. They're done to scare other people if they support the bill. And so now Amazon in Europe has pledged to allow sellers to use other shipping and logistics services and still be part of Amazon Prime. And they are doing this to settle an investigation by the European Commission, the exact thing that they said would break Prime in the U.S. That's what their claims are. How do we square the story Amazon is telling us here in the Senate and what they are actually doing in Europe and what they're doing to our consumers versus what's happening in Europe?
Unfortunately, I think it's an example of doublespeak. I understand that Amazon has incentives to want to hold on to the profits that they may and the revenues that they may get from self-preferencing, and in doing so, perhaps they overreached in their arguments to regulators and legislators here. But the proof is in the pudding. If they are offering this up, they offered this up as a voluntary commitment that in fact they can do this and still continue to offer Amazon Prime, there is your answer. I'm not sure how to square it other than that the original argument was disingenuous.
Okay, I have another question about another hypocrisy, but I'll go into let Senator Lee go.
Thanks. Professor Kanjip, did you want to respond to that last point we were talking about? I think there was a hanging Chad there somewhere.
The content moderation issue?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question. And it does go, as correctly pointed out, to the section, I think it's 3.3, that prohibits a platform from discriminating in the application and enforcement of a terms of service of the covered platforms among similarly situated business.
Having a hard time hearing you. Can you move your microphone? Yeah, thanks.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
Thanks.
So it goes back to the Section 3 that prohibits discrimination among similarly situated business users. And so what does that actually mean in life? Well, you could imagine, a dating app that only is for, Nazis or, communists or something like that, and a platform didn't want to have it. And the question is, what would be the remedy? I think it was pointed out, they would not have a private right of action. I mean, you would have to find some attorney general or the Department of Justice to take up their cause, which I would find extremely unlikely. I do that in the abstract. It does present this problem, but I think in reality, it's not something that is likely to occur.
Right, right. And if it were to occur, we're talking about a very weird niche market. I mean, one that would not likely amount to a significant percentage of the population ever, one would hope. And so if you ended up in that circumstance, you'd be dealing with something different than where you have politically motivated content moderation decisions that may cut against where roughly half of Americans are excluded from it. Is that part of their point?
Yes, precisely, because there is no private right of action. I mean, you'd have to have the judgment and common sense of elected officials, and I would be very surprised if they would take up that cause.
Right. All right. Back in 2021, Apple, Google, and Amazon, as you mentioned a little while ago, deplatformed Parler. This, of course, was a popular and quickly growing competitor to Twitter that was favored by many in the sort of libertarian to conservative community. Conservatives have, of course, been lectured for years that if conservatives don't like how a tech platform moderates content, then they should just go build your own, as many of us were told. So the Parler example, I think, illustrated how shallow and how empty that response would be. Do you agree that Google and Apple ought to be barred from preventing users from installing apps of their choice on their devices?
I think that's a reasonable, targeted remedy. As I pointed out, Google and Apple are only able to skew public discourse because of the market power they enjoy. I think a targeted solution that says, look, you're unusual, you're sui generis, you're the big guys. We all depend upon you. You have general obligations to the institutional values of the United States, and I think that would be a targeted and limited approach that would be effective.
Part of what has left so many of us cynical about what happened with Parler is the fact that Parler was, it had hit its sweet spot, it had hit its stride. It was doubling, I don't remember what the stats were, but it was doubling its user base every 6 weeks or something like that. It was growing by leaps and bounds, and all of a sudden in early 2021, out of the clear blue, some tech giants combine together and all decide, as if miraculously, that they're going to shut them down, and they do shut them down. Now, they make decisions eventually that allows Parler to come back, but by then the party's over. By then, it had lost the vibe, and these things are such that if you cut that off at the wrong time, and you take them essentially offline for a couple of months, it's a death knell, and they've never recovered as a result. Professor Scott Morton, could we have avoided the situation that we're in today if we had just had better enforcement of our antitrust laws over the last 10 or 15 years or so?
Thank you, Senator. I think the answer is not so much enforcement, but the jurisprudence in the courts. When you have rules like Brook Group and jurisprudence like Amex and Trinco, it really sets such a high bar for the plaintiffs that you can have very good enforcers, but they just aren't going to win in the places where the consumer needs them to win.
Do you think if the antitrust law has been weakened by lax enforcement, is that part of your point?
No, I think it's been weakened by a tradition that's very old now from the Chicago School in the 70s that made a lot of assumptions for courts, like markets will self-correct on their own, you should be really afraid to enforce, the predatory pricing doesn't exist, oligopolists can't collude, things that we know to be actually not part of the economic learning that we have and not part of how markets work. But if you make those assumptions, you don't need antitrust enforcement, and courts have been, therefore, dialing it back really quite steadily over the last 40 years.
Professor Francis, how do you respond to that same question?
I agree with, I think, almost everything Professor Scott Morton said. I think, a lot of the criticism that has been leveled at enforcement agencies would better have been leveled at the decisions of the federal courts on some important margins in the last couple decades. But I'll add that I also think part of the problem is that our statutory standards, even though we've been working on them for 130 odd years in the case of the Sherman Act, could really use some clarification, right? So 1890, the Sherman Act gives us restraint of trade and monopolize. Those are still battlegrounds in litigation today. 1914, Clayton Act, substantially lessened competition. The courts, for sure, have been taking, antitrust cases should be hard to win, but they shouldn't be impossible to win. So courts have been unduly receptive to defendant arguments for several decades. But it's not just the courts, it's also the fact that they're looking at statutes that really could be clarified by Congress in some pretty common sense ways that I think would really sharpen antitrust on some very important margins. Monopolization law, merger law in particular.
And doesn't that suggest that a lot of these problems could and should be dealt with most appropriately by through reforms to the way we enforce them, reforms like those suggested in the TEAM Act rather than implementing expansive, untested new regulatory regimes?
I think that antitrust enforcement, not just for a small number of tech companies, but across the economy, is the most important competition policy problem we face right now and an urgent need. And I want to just respond to the idea that ICOA is a kind of fast-track antitrust. It really is not. Antitrust enforcement focuses on the use of market power in ways that harm consumers. When you consider all pro-competitive justifications for a practice, it would be protecting inter-platform competition here, making sure that we weren't suppressing or deterring the emergence of competitors of Google and Facebook and Apple and others. and it rejects the kind of blanket duty to deal that ICOA imposes. So
Seems almost antitrust.
That is exactly.
Double negative. It's just a trust at that point.
It turns the trading partners of these platforms, who would be the very businesses best placed to become or to sponsor competitors, into stakeholders in the status quo. And not only is this not antitrust, it's not even accelerated antitrust. If Congress passes this bill, we're going to see a generational landslide of litigation over concepts like critical trading partner, fair and neutral search rankings, preference, part of or intrinsic to a digital project. The mechanism of enforcement is the same as antitrust. We're going to see enforcement actions brought by agencies moving through the federal courts at the same pace as antitrust, but doing less good.
So 133 years later, we're still arguing over things, the meaning of things enacted in 1890. If we enact other language, sure, we're still haggling over it, but we have developed over time a pretty sound understanding of what they mean. If we develop this could be another 130 years of exploratory litigation. It would be really good to fund the private college educations of the children of lawyers everywhere, but could create chaos.
This is going to cost the economy a fortune in compliance costs and attorney fees, even before we get to foregone innovations or failure to protect consumers. I would love to see us take a fraction of that money and use it to support antitrust enforcement.
All right, let's talk about the Open App Markets app for a minute. It, of course, banned dominant app stores from using MFNs. Would this help bring more competition to that space?
I think it could, Senator, and one of the things that I like about it is this promotes inter-platform competition. So the idea is that if you take away the power of an app store with market or monopoly power to say to app developers, hey, don't offer a better price elsewhere, if you take away their ability to do that, then suddenly big app developers can sponsor competition against the app store itself by offering discounts or other preferred terms. So I would support an MFN ban here, as in other markets, with market or monopoly power.
Professor Lewis, would ICOA prevent a company like Amazon from charging different prices to business users on its platform based on a user's size?
Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Lewis. I'm not a professor, but
I'm sorry.
that's okay.
Today you are.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, would ICOA, as you read it, would it prevent a company like Amazon from charging different prices to different business users on its platform based on their size or the volume in which they deal?
So on it, my reading of it is that it would not, but I would want to go back and really do an analysis to look at the statute and confirm that that's accurate.
Do you think it's unfair to charge different businesses different prices based on their size?
So again, I think I would have to give that some more thought because there's no context there. So I would really want to look at the individual facts of the situation before I would make a blanket statement.
Okay. Professor Scott Morton, let's go back to you for a minute. ICOA would require enforcement actions to be brought in federal court. Well, I've got concerns with the breadth of the bill. I view this element as absolutely essential to protecting due process. Would you agree with that?
Yes, that's right.
What in your view, are there things that would be better than this, or is this the right thing to do it?
Well, I think, as I said in my statement, in some ideal future world, we have a regulator who's expert and can use the public interest standard, not just competition, but privacy, security, all these other issues you've been raising. In the absence of that regulator, I'm against the status quo. I think we should try to move forward with a bill like this. I think the possibility of public enforcement rather than private enforcement limits the kinds of cases that are being brought to ones that are meritorious and necessary. And so with luck, you wouldn't get platforms engaging in litigation where it's pretty clear that the instructions in the statute require them to do something.
But you think it would be preferable to have them handled by experts in an enforcement agency, sort of a beefed-up panel of Uber experts?
Well, as I said, when we invent technologies, typically in the United States, we also bring a regulator along with them, whether that's trains or pharmaceuticals or airplanes or whatever. And I don't think this technology is any different in that regard. But it usually takes Congress a really long time to regulate dangerous things. I don't know why that is. You probably do. And so in the meanwhile, I think something like this, where we're working through the courts and building off of what we know from the antitrust context, is an excellent first step.
Okay. Thank you.
Very good. Senator Blumenthal.
Just a couple of quick questions. First, let me just say on the issue of enforcement, I spent most of my career in enforcement, some of it, in fact, in antitrust enforcement as state attorney general. So I'm all in on enforcement. And I'm also, frankly, I've been critical of federal antitrust enforcement. Often the states were ahead of the federal government in some cases on antitrust enforcement, which I say with some pride as a former state attorney general. But enforcement can't invent laws. People used to say to me, oh, you're too aggressive, even when we won cases. And I used to say, well, it's not me that gives us the power, it's the law. I can't do anything without the law on my side. So when we talk about clarifying or improving, we're just giving enforcers the tools that they need. And some of it is to avoid those loopholes and exemptions and exceptions that can swallow the rules. Let me ask you, Professor Scott Morton, and others can answer too. I understand that there have been media reports indicating that the Department of Justice is investigating Apple for some of the same exclusionary and tying practices that the Open App Markets Act and the American Innovation and Choice Online Act would help to prevent. Why should we not just rely on the Department of Justice to try to enforce existing law at some point, I don't know, a year, 2 years, 5 years, a decade from now?
Well, I think you've answered your own question. The Google search case that was filed in 2020 hasn't come to trial yet. Typically, a case takes some years of investigation before it's brought. Then the court needs to write an opinion. Then there's an appeal, and it goes from there. And at the end of that process, it's not clear what the remedy is because the platform has become so entrenched over so long that it's really hard to do anything to restore the lost competition. So that's why I think this bill is really useful because it holds out the prospect of much more immediate relief for consumers. We would have competition on the platform in short order, and I think that's both safer and quicker for consumers.
Well,
Senator, you mind if I accept your invitation
Yes,
to
please do.
add something? I can't understand why anyone thinks ICOA enforcement will be any faster than antitrust enforcement. It's going to be complaints filed in the same federal courts, proceeding under the same discovery rules on the same slow timetables, except all the terms are new and don't have the benefit of 130 years of precedent and doctrine to guide them. This is not like the DMA. To make the DMA work, the institutional structure of the European Union is critical. The European Commission proposed it. They issue implementing acts to tell specific companies how to comply. They conduct compliance audits, they take enforcement actions, and then they issue decisions on them. So there's only one actor that has a bureaucratic monopoly on the process. And whether or not one likes that system, that is not our order. So I don't think this would be faster at all.
I disagree. I'm sorry. I disagree with that characterization. I mean, one important thing that ACOA and OAMA both do is to absolutely streamline one concept that is extremely time-consuming and expert intensive in antitrust law, and that is market power. And so a COA has a definition of critical trading partner. And yes, it may be litigated, the scope of what that means, but Congress is telling the agencies and the courts what it means. There is a description and explanation of that. When it comes to OAMA, the word competition is not there. There are much fewer terms to interpret. It is more a bit more straightforward because it is much narrower. And for OAMA, there is no need to prove a relevant market definition, to assign market shares, and so both bills, I believe, would streamline the process. I'd also add that the DMA, once it was passed, it already, the idea is to avoid litigation here by making clear what conduct is prohibited. And so I think you would expect to see changes. Companies will respond differently, but some of these digital platforms, I believe, will, if these laws are passed, make changes that will benefit consumers and businesses in response to that.
Yeah, I think, Professor Francis, your comment is correct. The rules of discovery are the same. The rules of evidence are the same. The federal procedure is the same. But the cause of action is different. The cause of action is targeted and streamlined. So you may have discovery, but it's not going to be on a kitchen sink. It can be on literally one topic, and it can be streamlined. The whole process can be streamlined. And equally important, the remedy is clearer. A lot of the litigation, you take the Microsoft case, which I was involved in, half the litigation was about the remedy. The judge ordered the company broken up. He found liability. The Court of Appeals reversed, and frankly, we didn't ask for the company to be broken up. So, I think it comes down to the cause of action, defining what the wrong is, what the legal violation is, and this is a targeted and streamlined process. Professor Scott Morton, did you have a comment?
No, I just agree. In particular, if you've got these very specific rules, you're looking for an MFN. Discoveries about whether there's an MFN. That doesn't take years. So I agree with your characterization.
Professor Francis.
Senator, I think this is exactly where the rubber meets the road, right? So we were told earlier that the harm to competition language in the bill, exactly as you say, in the heart of the cause of action, would make sure that this bill stopped harmful conduct and allowed good conduct. If that's right, then litigation over harm to competition will mean exactly litigation over market definition and market power and effects evidence. It can't
Well, I don't know. If Apple says to an app store or an app developer, you need to pay 30% of your revenue to get on our store, and you show the market power of Apple, that's pretty well defined, right?
I don't know, Senator. So number one, I think a lot of businesses charge 30% that don't have anything like market power. And number two, I am sure that if there's a harm to competition test in the bill, regardless of where the burden is, there's going to be all the litigation over it that looks exactly like any competitive effects litigation we see today.
Frankly, if my job is to show that Apple has a monopoly or overwhelming market power on app stores, I'll take that side of the case. And I won't even charge for it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Very, very good. Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. So we have a vote that's been called. I thought I would just ask one more question, and that is actually in the area of hypocrisy again with what's been going on around the world. We talked, Ms. Lewis, about how Amazon claimed we'd break Amazon Prime and then in fact is agreeing to the exact same thing they said would break Amazon Prime in other countries. And this committee has previously heard from small businesses that experience retaliation. You and I talked about that. And I think that's very important because they've always been emphasizing that that they are promoting small businesses, yet we now have many of them that are coming forward, even if they don't want to come forward individually through their trade associations. And then on another front, and this involves Apple, we made improvements, as you know, to the bill to clarify that the platforms can take actions that were reasonably necessary to protect privacy and security. That was something that some of the opponents of the bill, they have about 15 different things that they try out with members and test drive in various ways or send emails about. And one of them was this. We know they hired some former security people, and some of the members thought they were current security people at one of the hearings. They were not. And in fact, as I noted, the Justice Department has endorsed this bill. So while we heard from Apple that the changes that we made were not enough, they reportedly plan to allow third-party app stores on the iPhone in Europe. Is there any reason why they can't do the same thing in the United States?
Senator Klobuchar, I am not aware of any reason. And if you look to the example of the fact that a user of a MacBook or an Apple a laptop, either their laptops or desktops, are able to download apps from alternative sources, and there seems to be no problem with that. So I have not heard any credible explanation as to why Apple cannot allow alternative methods of distribution for apps on the iPhone. I see no reason why they can do it in Europe, but they cannot do it here. I see no reason why they can do it for desktops or laptop products, and they can't do it for the iPhone. That just doesn't add up to me.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think this is one of the failed arguments that they have been trying to make, and we clearly worked with them on making improvements to the bill, but still they persist. So do you believe that this bill ensures that the companies can continue to protect privacy and security and even improve their security and privacy provisions if they'd like?
I do. And so I know that there have been changes to the Open App Markets Act from the version that was introduced in the House. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, many of these changes have been made to respond to criticisms of the bill that it was not sufficiently clear that the covered app stores and the operators would be able to protect user privacy and security. I think that the bill sponsors here have gone above and beyond to respond to those criticisms, which I don't think were necessarily valid. I think the bill was allowed for that in its current form. But the bill sponsors have gone above and beyond to add language in response to those critiques and work with important and knowledgeable civil society groups that are more expert in privacy and security than I am to ensure that the bill does make that clear.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the very point. We made over 100 changes to the bill between the introduction, the markup, as we headed to the floor. But the point is that they just keep moving the ball. So they don't really want to work with us on these changes, or they would have, I think, come to some agreement on provisions, but they don't want to. They just want to stop it, and they keep coming up with new arguments. I think that's unfortunate. Maybe these Section 230 hearings and the like will make people be more sensible. But right now, as I noted at the beginning of the hearing, they are just, if we do nothing, we are allowing other countries to come up with a solution. Some of them we'll like, some of them we won't. But that's what's happening right now. And it's clear that some of these most common sense things that they just hit back at vociferously are things they actually could do without breaking the internet, breaking Amazon Prime, breaking Google Maps, or breaking the app stores. So in any case, this has been an incredibly good hearing. I don't want to be the last one to vote. That would be bad. I'm really glad one of the benefits of having a year and making over 100 changes and hearing these same arguments over and over again. I think it's very important for our colleagues. We had 11 senators here, which is more than we have for most full committee hearings. So people were really able to engage and be part of this discussion, as well as their staffs either here or watching online. And so that will help to inform them as we go forward. I think answered a lot of the questions that were raised. We don't expect to agree on everything, but I am glad, Professor Francis, that we agree on the antitrust funding and some of the other things that are necessary, and that we all agree that there is a problem, and that we agree that I would say just doing nothing may not be the answer here. So thank you so much. We're going to leave the record open for 1 week. I imagine some of the senators that could not join us or had to leave early, and we really appreciate those that came by, may have some additional questions for the record, and of course we welcome that. So the record will remain open for 1 week until March 14th, 2023. Thank you very much. The hearing is adjourned.